The string quartet finished their prelude as guests settled into white folding chairs arranged across the manicured lawn of the Rosewood Country Club. My cousin David's wedding was everything he'd dreamed of: elegant, expensive, and designed to showcase the success he'd built in event planning. The late afternoon sun cast golden light across the ceremony space, where 200 guests had gathered to celebrate David and his fiancée Rebecca's perfect day. I sat in the back row wearing a simple black suit from Target, watching my family navigate the social hierarchy that had defined our gatherings for decades. At 32, David had built a thriving event planning business, specializing in high-end weddings and corporate functions. He'd been featured in Southern Living magazine twice, had a waiting list of clients, and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone how far he'd come from our working-class roots in rural Tennessee. Growing up, David and I had been inseparable. We'd spent summers at our grandmother's house in Nashville, sharing dreams of escaping small-town limitations and making something of ourselves. While other kids played sports or video games, we'd huddle around Grammy's old radio, analyzing every song, debating production choices, and imagining our names in album credits. David eventually channeled that creative energy into event planning, while I had chosen a different path entirely. The ceremony was flawless. Rebecca looked radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown, David beamed in his Italian tuxedo, and the photographer captured every moment with the precision of someone charging premium rates. The officiant, a family friend who'd known David since high school, spoke about love, commitment, and the journey that had brought two successful professionals together. When they kissed as husband and wife, the crowd erupted in applause, and rose petals fell like snow across the perfectly choreographed scene. During cocktail hour, I nursed a club soda and watched David work the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd found his calling. He moved seamlessly between conversations, discussing vendor recommendations with other wedding guests, sharing business cards with potential clients, networking even at his own reception. This was his world: luxury events, six-figure budgets, clients who expected perfection and were willing to pay for it. The reception tent was a masterpiece of design, with crystal chandeliers suspended from the ceiling, ivory linens draped across round tables, and centerpieces of white orchids and eucalyptus that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. David's business partners mingled with Rebecca's colleagues from the law firm, while family members clustered around the bar, catching up on years of accumulated news and gossip. "Alex." David's voice boomed across the patio as he approached with Rebecca still glowing in her wedding dress. "Glad you could make it, cuz." We embraced, and I could smell the expensive cologne he'd started wearing since his business took off. David had always been ambitious, but success had given him a polish that sometimes made me feel like we were from different worlds entirely. "Beautiful ceremony," I said sincerely. "You and Rebecca look perfect together." "Thanks, man." David's smile was genuine, but I could see the familiar mixture of affection and pity in his eyes. "Rebecca, this is my cousin Alex. The one I told you about." Rebecca's polite smile faltered slightly. She'd clearly heard stories about the family's struggling musician, the cousin who'd never quite figured out how to turn his passion into a real career. Her handshake was warm but brief, the kind of greeting reserved for relatives who meant well but hadn't quite found their footing in life. "Alex still plays music," David explained, his tone carrying that particular blend of encouragement and condescension that family members use when discussing relatives who haven't quite lived up to their potential. "Been at it for years. Real dedicated." "How wonderful," Rebecca said diplomatically. "Do you perform locally?" Before I could answer, David jumped in. "Alex is more of a behind-the-scenes guy. Studio work mainly. Still trying to find his big break, aren't you, buddy?" The phrase, "still trying," hung in the air like a diagnosis. It was David's polite way of acknowledging my career choice while simultaneously categorizing it as an extended phase rather than a legitimate profession. I'd heard variations of this introduction at family gatherings for 8 years, ever since I'd graduated from Belmont University and announced my intention to pursue music production professionally. "Something like that," I replied simply. Other family members began gravitating toward our conversation, drawn by the familiar rhythm of checking in on the family's ongoing concern. Uncle Pete and Aunt Martha approached with their drinks, followed by my parents and David's business partners. The gathering felt like an informal tribunal, with me as the subject of gentle but persistent inquiry about my life choices. "Alex." Uncle Pete clapped me on the shoulder with the enthusiasm of someone genuinely happy to see family. "How's the music business treating you?" Uncle Pete owned 3 hardware stores across Middle Tennessee and measured success in terms of consistent revenue and employee benefits. He'd built a solid middle-class life through hard work and practical choices, and he'd never quite understood why anyone would choose the uncertainty of creative industries. "Can't complain," I said. "Still working out of that little apartment studio?" Aunt Martha asked with the tone of someone hoping for better news. She'd visited my place once, seen the soundproofing foam on the walls and the mixing board that took up most of my living room, and had spent the rest of the evening suggesting more practical uses for the space. The studio setup looked chaotic to outsiders. Cables everywhere, multiple monitors, keyboards stacked against walls, but it was precisely organized for the work I did. "For now," I nodded. Mom moved closer, her maternal concern evident in the way she touched my arm. "Honey, you know it's not too late to consider other options. David always says he could use help with his business." David nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. Event planning is booming. I could teach you the ropes, get you started on the business side. Real money in it." His offer was generous and well-intentioned, but it carried the implicit assumption that my current path was a dead end requiring rescue. David had been making similar offers for 3 years, ever since his business had really taken off and he'd started earning what he considered serious money. "I mean, look around," David gestured at the elegant reception. "This one event brought in $45,000. And I've got bookings solid through next fall." The family had been having variations of this conversation for 8 years, ever since I'd graduated college and announced my intention to pursue music production professionally. They'd watched me work odd jobs to pay rent, everything from coffee shops to warehouse shifts, while spending every free moment in recording studios, mixing tracks and collaborating with artists they'd never heard of. "I appreciate that," I said. "Really? Think about it," David pressed. "I'm talking serious money here. Last month alone I cleared more than most people make in a year. Rebecca and I are already looking at houses in Belmead." He wasn't bragging exactly, just trying to illustrate the practical benefits of choosing a conventional career path. Belmead was Nashville's most exclusive neighborhood, where celebrities and music executives lived behind gates and privacy hedges. For David, it represented the ultimate symbol of having made it. "The music thing is fine as a hobby," Dad added supportively. "But at some point you need to think about the future. Health insurance, retirement planning, building something substantial." Dad had worked 30 years at the same manufacturing plant, had raised 3 kids on a steady paycheck, and believed deeply in the security that came from traditional employment. He'd never understood why I'd chosen such an unpredictable path when there were safer alternatives available. Their concern was real and rooted in love. They'd watched me spend years living paycheck to paycheck, driving a Honda with 200,000 miles on it, wearing the same clothes until they fell apart. From their perspective, I was a talented person wasting his potential on an unrealistic dream. "Remember when you used to talk about being a lawyer?" Mom asked wistfully. "You had such good grades, such a bright future ahead of you." I'd actually considered law school during my junior year at Belmont, had even taken the LSAT and scored well enough for several good programs. But something about the idea of spending 3 more years studying other people's rules had felt suffocating. Music production offered something law couldn't, the chance to create something new every day. "Or teaching," Aunt Martha suggested. "You could teach music, have summers off, good benefits. Much more stable than this." She gestured vaguely in my direction, as if my career choice was something visible that could be indicated with hand movements. The dismissal was gentle but clear. What I was doing wasn't quite legitimate enough to be called a profession. "Still a struggling musician?" David asked, his voice rising slightly as more family members joined the circle. The question wasn't meant to be cruel. It was David's way of trying to motivate me toward what he saw as a more practical path. Around us, the wedding reception continued in full swing. The DJ was playing a carefully curated playlist of crowd pleasers, the kind of songs that got people dancing regardless of their age or musical preferences. I recognized several tracks immediately, not because I was familiar with the artists, but because I'd had a hand in creating them. "When will you quit the fantasy?" David continued, his tone carrying the frustration of someone who'd spent years watching a loved one make what seemed like poor choices. The question drew attention from nearby guests. Other successful professionals who'd built conventional careers and couldn't quite understand why someone would persist in an industry known for crushing dreams and financial instability. Rebecca's law firm colleagues exchanged glances, while David's business partners looked sympathetic but puzzled. I looked around the circle of concerned faces. Family members who loved me, successful people who'd found traditional paths to prosperity, individuals who genuinely wanted what was best for me but couldn't comprehend why I'd chosen such an uncertain route. Their success was visible and quantifiable. David's thriving business, Uncle Pete's expanding store chain, Rebecca's partnership track at a prestigious firm. My work remained invisible to them, hidden behind studio walls and anonymous credits. Maybe soon, I smiled, keeping my voice calm and non-committal. The response seemed to satisfy them, suggesting that I was finally coming to my senses about the impracticality of pursuing music as a career. David nodded approvingly, while Mom looked relieved that I might finally be ready to consider more stable alternatives. "That's what I like to hear," Uncle Pete said, raising his bourbon. "Sometimes it takes time to realize what's really important." "Experience is the best teacher," Dad added philosophically. "Alex has always had to learn things the hard way." The conversation continued around me as family members shared stories of career changes, friends who'd found success in unexpected fields, and opportunities available for someone willing to apply their talents in more practical directions. The underlying message was consistent. It wasn't too late to choose a realistic path. David's phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it, focused on what he clearly saw as an important family intervention. This was his wedding day, but he was still taking time to address what everyone considered my ongoing life crisis. "The thing is," David continued, "talent is great, but you need to be strategic about how you use it. Look at what I've built. I took my creative skills and channeled them into something that actually pays the bills." He gestured toward the reception tent, where guests were enjoying dinner under those crystal chandeliers. The event represented everything David valued: visible success, satisfied clients, measurable profit, social recognition. It was impressive by any standard, and he'd built it from nothing through hard work and smart business decisions. "Plus, there's room for creativity in event planning," Rebecca added supportively. "David designs amazing experiences for people. It's still artistic work, just more practical." More phones began buzzing around the circle. Rebecca pulled hers out first, frowning at the screen, then Uncle Pete, then several of David's business partners. The synchronized notification sound was distinctive, the kind that suggested breaking news or viral content spreading across social media. "What's going on?" Rebecca asked, staring at her screen with confusion. David's phone continued buzzing insistently. He finally pulled it out, his expression shifting from annoyance to bewilderment as he read whatever had appeared on his screen. The color drained from his face as he scrolled through what appeared to be a news article. This can't be right," he muttered. "What can't be right?" Mom asked, her maternal instincts immediately alert to potential family crisis. David looked up from his phone, then back down, then up again, as if the screen might reveal different information upon repeated viewing. "There's a Billboard article, it says." He trailed off, apparently unable to process what he was reading. Around us, more phones were buzzing as the same alert reached other wedding guests. The DJ in the reception tent seemed to have received the same notification, because the music stopped abruptly mid-song. Then the Billboard alert: mystery producer behind 20 platinum albums revealed. David read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. The music from the reception tent had stopped completely now. David's DJ stopped the music, as the notification apparently reached him as well, and he was presumably reading the same article that had stunned everyone else. A hush fell over the cocktail gathering as phones continued buzzing throughout the crowd. Guests throughout the reception were reading the same alert, their expressions shifting from confusion to amazement as they absorbed the news. Conversations at other tables had stopped, replaced by the glow of phone screens and hushed voices reading aloud to each other. "This can't be right," David repeated, his voice stronger now but still filled with disbelief. It says the producer behind some of the biggest hits of the last decade has been working under the name Rivers. And it shows." He held up his phone, displaying what appeared to be a professional headshot. My professional headshot, though I couldn't remember when it had been taken. The photo showed me in a recording studio, wearing headphones and sitting at a mixing board much more sophisticated than the one in my apartment. Alex Rivers. That's you. That's your name. The circle of family members stood frozen, trying to process information that didn't match their understanding of my career situation. Around us, other wedding guests were reading the same story, their voices rising in excitement and disbelief as they realized they were in the presence of someone whose work had apparently shaped popular music for years. According to this, Uncle Pete said slowly, reading from his own phone, Rivers has produced 20 platinum albums, worked with, Jesus, these are some of the biggest names in music. He began listing artists, his voice growing fainter with each name. These weren't obscure indie musicians or local Nashville acts. These were international superstars, Grammy winners, artists whose songs dominated radio playlists and streaming services worldwide. Mom's hands were shaking as she held her phone. Says he's worth. Alex, this says you're worth $57 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. Rebecca nearly dropped her bouquet, while David's business partners, who had been politely listening to the family discussion about my career prospects, suddenly looked at me with entirely different expressions. The article mentions specific albums. Aunt Martha read, her voice barely above a whisper. Songs that have been #1 on Billboard for weeks. Collaborative projects with artists who've won Grammys. Multiple Grammys, Dad corrected, his own phone now open to the same story. It says Rivers has been credited on recordings that have won 8 Grammy Awards over the past 5 years. David was scrolling frantically through his phone, cross-referencing the information with other sources. Rolling Stone has a feature story. So does Variety. Billboard is calling it, the producer who changed everything while staying invisible. The reception tent had fallen completely silent now. Not just the music but the conversations, the clinking of silverware, even the catering staff seemed to have paused their work. The wedding that had been David's perfect moment was transforming into something entirely different. But you live in that tiny apartment, Mom said weakly, her voice carrying all the confusion of a parent who thought she understood her child's life. You drive that old Honda. You buy your clothes at Target. I like the apartment, I said simply. And the Honda runs fine. Target has good basics. It was true. The apartment was small, but it was in Music Row, walking distance from most of the studios where I worked. The Honda was reliable and anonymous, perfect for someone who preferred to avoid attention. The clothes were functional and comfortable, which mattered more than fashion when you spent 18 hours a day in recording studios. This article mentions a private recording studio. Rebecca read from her phone, her legal training apparently helping her process complex information under pressure. A state-of-the-art facility that cost $2.3 million to build. It says you own it outright. The studio's important for the work, I explained. That was an understatement. The facility was 15,000 square feet of perfectly tuned acoustic space, with equipment that most commercial studios couldn't afford. It was where the real work happened. The late-night sessions, the experimental collaborations, the careful crafting of sounds that would eventually reach millions of listeners. David was staring at his phone like it had betrayed him. There's a photo gallery of recording sessions. These are artists I listen to every day. Artists whose songs I've used at my events. Which songs? I asked curiously. He began listing titles, his voice growing fainter with each one. Every song he mentioned was something I'd produced, mixed, or co-written over the past 5 years. The music that had provided the soundtrack to his successful events, the hits that had made his parties memorable and his reputation strong. Much of it had come from the cousin he'd been trying to rescue from an unrealistic career choice. The Billboard article has quotes from industry executives. Uncle Pete continued reading. They're calling Rivers the most influential producer of the modern era, and the secret architect behind a generation of hit music. The quotes were probably accurate. I'd been working with the same group of artists, engineers, and executives for years, building relationships based on results rather than publicity. The music industry was smaller than people realized. Success bred more success, and anonymity had allowed me to work without the distractions that came with celebrity. It mentions collaboration with international artists, Aunt Martha added, her voice filled with awe. Film soundtracks that have won Academy Awards. Television themes that are recognized worldwide. How long? David asked quietly, setting down his phone and looking directly at me. How long have you been this person? About 8 years, I replied. Since college. 8 years, he repeated slowly, the number settling over him like a weight. 8 years of family dinners where we've been worried about your career. 8 years of offering advice about finding stable employment. The weight of 8 years of concern, intervention attempts, and gentle suggestions settled over the group. Every conversation about my future, every offer of help, every expression of worry had been based on a complete misunderstanding of my actual circumstances. The financial breakdown is extraordinary, one of David's business partners said, reading from his phone. Revenue from album sales, streaming royalties, licensing deals, production fees. This is Fortune 500 level success. He was a financial advisor who specialized in helping small business owners plan for retirement. His assessment carried the weight of professional expertise, and his tone suggested he was recalculating everything he thought he knew about wealth building and career success. But you never said anything. Mom's voice was small and confused. We've been worried about you for years. I know, I said gently. You weren't supposed to worry. The truth was I'd tried to tell them in small ways over the years. I'd mentioned working with successful artists, had invited them to events where my collaborators were performing, had even tried to explain the business model of modern music production. But their frame of reference for success was so different from mine that the information hadn't translated. Why the secrecy? Dad asked, his voice carrying the hurt of a parent who felt excluded from his child's achievements. Why let us think you were struggling? Because I wasn't struggling, I replied. I was working. The anonymity was part of the strategy. Producers don't usually seek publicity. We're behind the scenes by design. It was more than strategy, though. Anonymity had allowed me to focus on the music without the distractions that came with fame. I could walk into any studio in Nashville, Los Angeles, or New York without being recognized, could collaborate with established artists without bringing ego or expectations to the process. David's wedding guests were beginning to approach our group, drawn by the commotion and the realization that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The man they'd been introduced to as David's cousin, the struggling musician who served as a cautionary tale about unrealistic dreams, was actually one of the most successful producers in the industry. Sir. The photographer approached hesitantly, his professional instincts recognizing a story worth documenting. Would it be possible to get some photos? This is quite a story. David looked around his reception. The elegant setup, the expensive decorations, the carefully orchestrated celebration of his success. Everything that had seemed impressive an hour earlier now felt modest in comparison to the revelation that his cousin had quietly built an empire while everyone assumed he was failing. The article mentions current projects, Rebecca said, still reading through multiple sources. Collaborations with artists who are scheduled to headline major festivals. Albums that are expected to dominate the charts for the next year. I stay busy, I acknowledged. That was another understatement. The schedule was relentless. Sessions often running from noon until 4 in the morning, recording in Nashville one day and flying to Los Angeles the next, managing projects for a dozen different artists simultaneously. The work was demanding but creatively fulfilling in ways that traditional careers couldn't match. Busy. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. You've been redefining popular music while we've been trying to convince you to get into event planning. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The family member they'd viewed as needing guidance had actually achieved a level of success that dwarfed everyone else's accomplishments. The cousin they'd tried to help had been helping shape global culture while maintaining perfect anonymity. There's going to be a formal announcement, Uncle Pete continued, reading from what appeared to be a separate article. A press conference where you'll be recognized publicly for the first time. Industry leaders are calling it historic. Thursday afternoon, I confirmed. At the Grammy Museum. The Grammy Museum, Aunt Martha repeated faintly, as if the location itself carried significance she was only now beginning to understand. The Grammy Museum was where the industry honored its most influential figures, where careers were celebrated and legacies were established. Having a press conference there meant something specific in music circles. It was reserved for announcements that would reshape how people understood the business. Around us, the wedding reception had transformed into something completely different. Instead of celebrating David and Rebecca's marriage, Guests were processing the revelation that they were in the presence of someone whose work had influenced their daily lives for years without their knowledge. "I should probably go," I said to David. "This is your day. I don't want to overshadow." "Are you kidding?" David interrupted, his voice carrying a mixture of amazement and something that might have been pride. "This is incredible. I mean, I'm processing it, but it's incredible." His tone had shifted completely. The condescension was gone, replaced by genuine amazement and perhaps a touch of awe. The cousin he'd been trying to rescue was actually the most successful person at his wedding. "The article mentions your next project," Rebecca said, still scrolling through her phone with the focused attention of someone trained to analyze complex information. "A collaboration that's expected to be the biggest album release of the decade." "Should be interesting," I said simply. The project was actually 3 simultaneous albums with artists from different genres, plus a film soundtrack that would premiere at Sundance. It represented 18 months of work and would probably generate more revenue than most small countries' annual budgets. But explaining that would have required context that was impossible to provide in the middle of a wedding reception. "Interesting." Mom laughed, her voice shaky with emotion. "Honey, you've been living a completely different life than we thought." The understatement of the century, delivered in the setting of David's perfect wedding, surrounded by family members who were recalibrating their understanding of success, achievement, and the wisdom of conventional career advice. David's DJ had resumed playing music, but at a lower volume, acknowledging that the evening had taken an unexpected turn. The playlist, I noticed, included several songs I'd produced, hits that had become wedding staples without anyone knowing their connection to the family's supposedly struggling musician. "I have so many questions," David said, his earlier confidence replaced by curiosity and what might have been respect. "How does it work? How do you create all this without anyone knowing?" "Long hours," I replied. "Good collaborators. Staying focused on the music rather than the publicity." It was an oversimplification, but the real answer would have taken hours to explain. The business model of modern music production was complex, involving multiple revenue streams, international licensing agreements, and collaborative relationships that spanned continents. Success depended on understanding technology, psychology, business, and art simultaneously. But the money, the success, the recognition, don't you want people to know? "The music speaks for itself," I said. "Whether people know my name doesn't change the songs." It was a philosophy that had guided 8 years of career decisions, 8 years of choosing artistic integrity over public recognition, 8 years of building something substantial while everyone assumed I was chasing an impossible dream. "Thursday's announcement will change that," Rebecca observed, her legal mind already processing the implications of public recognition. "Probably," I agreed. "But the work stays the same." The work was what mattered. The late nights perfecting a vocal arrangement, the technical precision required to layer instruments without losing clarity, the collaborative process of helping artists find sounds they didn't know they were looking for. Recognition was nice, but it was secondary to the actual creation. David's wedding would be remembered for many reasons. The beautiful ceremony, the elegant reception, the moment when a family discovered that their assumptions about success needed complete revision. But mostly it would be remembered as the night everyone learned that greatness doesn't always announce itself, and sometimes the person you're trying to help is actually the one changing the world. The photographer was documenting everything now, recognizing that he was capturing something unprecedented, the moment when a family's understanding of achievement was permanently altered by a Billboard notification. These photos would probably end up in magazines themselves, illustrating the human interest story of how success can hide in plain sight. As the evening continued, phones buzzed with interview requests from music journalists, congratulations from industry colleagues I'd worked with over the years, and social media notifications as the story spread across entertainment news. The reception that had been designed to celebrate David's success had become the backdrop for a revelation that redefined everyone's understanding of what success actually looked like. David raised his champagne glass as the sun set over the country club, casting long shadows across the manicured grounds. "To family," he said, his voice carrying new respect and perhaps a touch of humility. "And to never assuming you know the whole story." The toast was heartfelt, acknowledging both the celebration of his marriage and the discovery that the cousin he'd been trying to save had actually been the most accomplished person in the room all along. As the reception continued into the evening, I found myself surrounded by family members who were seeing me with completely new eyes. The struggling musician had become the mystery producer, the family concern had become the family success story, and the person they'd tried to help had revealed himself to be someone whose achievements made their own accomplishments seem modest by comparison. David's perfect wedding had become something even more memorable. The night his family learned that success comes in many forms, and sometimes the most extraordinary achievements happen in complete silence, recognized only by the millions of people who sing along without knowing who created the music that shapes their lives. The reception finally wound down near midnight, guests departing with stories they'd be telling for years. David and Rebecca left for their honeymoon in Italy, but not before David pulled me aside for a private conversation that lasted nearly an hour. He wanted to understand everything: the business model, the creative process, the decision to remain anonymous for so long. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "No," I replied. "You owe me nothing. You were being a good cousin trying to help with what you thought was a problem. But I was wrong about everything. You were working with the information you had. That's all any of us can do." David's wedding night ended with him realizing that his cousin's quiet confidence over the years hadn't been delusion or stubbornness, but the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what he was building, even when no one else could see it. The Billboard story would run for a week, followed by features in Rolling Stone, Variety, and every major music publication. The Grammy Museum press conference would draw industry executives from around the world, finally putting a face to the name that had appeared in album credits for nearly a decade. But the real story had happened that evening at David's wedding, the moment when a family discovered that their idea of success, achievement, and practical career choices needed complete revision, and when the person they'd spent years trying to save revealed himself to be the one who had actually been succeeding beyond their wildest imagination.